For everyone that is joining, welcome back to all of our attendees, and to those who are just joining us. I am so excited and grateful to be with Dr. Reverend Nichole Phillips, who is the Associate Professor in the Practice of Sociology of Religion and Culture and the Director of Black Church Studies at Candler School of Theology at Emory University, as well as Reverend Harvey Clemons Jr., who is the pastor of Pleasant Hills Baptist Church in Houston. My name is Dr. Rachel Schneider, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Religion and Public Life program, and I will be joining Dr. Phillips and Reverend Clemons in their conversation together about race, social justice, and science, and the virtue of shalom. So welcome, Dr. Phillips. Welcome, Reverend Clemons.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, you're so welcome. Maybe we could begin with both of you just sharing a little bit about where you're most passionate about seeing justice or equality brought into the world.
Okay. So I'll start. The question is a huge question.
Yes.
But thankfully we have the good thoughts and the guidance of Elaine's book to help us think through the questions that you're about to ask us. So I'll start by saying it's been a wonderful conference, and I've been listening all day, and we've been I've heard the lecturers who preceded us talk about humanness. And Elaine's book does an excellent job of drawing out humanness and relating it to the sanctity of life. And so when I'm thinking about social justice and equality and what I'm passionate about, I want to lay a little bit of a background in terms of thinking through humanness and the sanctity of life with respect to the evolutionary process, because the evolution and the evolutionary process has to do with human origins. And we already know that science has a lot to say about human origins as well as the Christian faith. But in my humble opinion and from my perspective, evolution is not just about a process, but it really also points to what it means to be human, who is human, who's considered not human, as well as the sanctity of life. And so, if with that background, what I'm passionate about is the fact that at this Kairos moment, and I'm using a religious term, at this Kairos moment, we have two major issues colliding. We have COVID-19 that essentially arrested movement throughout the globe. And then at this point now, internationally, we have the Black Lives Matters movement. And so I believe that the COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matters movement together help us to think through these questions of who is human, what values do we place on human life, and these are questions that are not just ethical and moral questions, but these are scientific and theological questions. And at the heart of these questions are justice issues, because some lives are valued over others. And so for me, that's where I see this kind of dialogue between faith and science connecting with my passion around humanness and the sanctity of life.
That makes so much sense. Reverend Clemons, do you have anything to add or share about, the places that you feel particularly passionate or even convicted around seeing justice or equality brought into the world?
Yeah, first of all, I'd just like to say thanks, Dr. Snyder, and to the Elaine for the work that you all do with religion and public life in that whole program, and to Haley for coordinating and helping us get here. I saw something from an unknown poet that said, I sought to see the face of Jesus. And so I climbed to the top of the steeple. And Jesus said, if you want to see me, then you need to go down among the people. And so I think the thing that I'm most passionate about is down among the people. And whenever you are down among the people, you're in the heart of where Jesus is. And of course, that comes with the struggle. And that, I think, is the reason why I'm so fascinated by what Elaine is attempting to get us to understand with this idea of shalom and stewardship. Because I can tell you, in my 36, 37 years of pastoring and preaching and looking at that, I've done a number of sermons on peace, but I've never really made an association with this idea of peace and stewardship. So I'm so excited about that. I'm excited to be sharing this panel with Dr. Phillips. And just feel honored to be in the presence of you good doctors.
Oh, thank you. And I think both of you touch on such important things, that these issues are real life and death issues. Mm-hmm. They're issues that really sort of matter to people and communities. They're not abstract. And so, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how science can be a tool that can actually advance justice, advance equity, help rightly recognize the value of human lives that may have not been valued or not be valued, how it can be a tool to bring value, to acknowledge humanness, and to help people on the ground.
I'll jump in here.
Please.
Okay. So I start with where Elaine started this conference, as well as where she starts her book about religion and science and faith and science, often masquerading as conflict, although for some those are conflictual, both subject matters. But I loved the fact that she essentially says that the conflict masks what is really happening, which is fear. And so I believe that we cannot be afraid to begin to talk about and to treat hard subjects. And the hard subject, one of the hard subjects with respect to science, if we're going to talk about justice, is the ways in which science has contributed to scientific racism. So I heard earlier eugenics studies. We know about eugenics studies. We know about social Darwinism. There has been cranial studies, and all of these studies throughout history with respect to race often have to do with race and intelligence. And so what is interesting for me is that during this period, I've been being tapped by chief executives of diversity and inclusion at corporations to deliver presentations at the intersection of race and the US nation. And they get a bonus, which is interesting. They get a bonus with it being at the intersection of race, religion, and the US nation. Because in our corporations, we have people who are religious, and they want to understand and talk about the ways in which religion may or may not contribute to our justice issues. And so I start out with the ways in which science has treated race historically. So there have been benign ways. And so I started out my previous answer with the evolutionary process. That's benign. But it's no longer benign when we impute a certain value and meaning to particular lives. And so, in the studies that I mentioned with respect to race and intelligence, often darker peoples, Black people are usually less intelligent, inferior, and white or lighter skinned people are either more intelligent or most intelligent. And the interesting thing is, when we talk about scientific racism colludes with colorism, because I didn't say white and Black. Yes, white and Black, but also lighter skinned and darker skinned, and colludes with sexism. Women can't be scientists. And I think of even most recently, in the 1990s, the Bell Curve, which was published. And that was a controversial book because it entered into this kind of scientific racism. And so for me, the way in which science can begin to address justice issues is around education. But then I don't want to just talk about it in terms of science. We also have to talk about it in terms of religion, since this is a faith and science conference, and since we're tasked with talking about race and social justice. And I think about and since I also teach African American religion, I think about what I would identify as also evolutionary racism, the way in which peoples of color have been cast in like creation stories. So like for the Black community and Black religious communities, in many respects, they continue to have to justify and wrestle with kind of what is considered the Hamitic curse.
Right.
The fact that, Ham saw Noah, his father, who was naked, and because of that, he was cursed. And so in the antebellum period and postbellum period, we've had Black political and religious leaders debunking the fact that just because Ham was cursed does not mean the Black race was cursed, okay? Because they're tracing the lineage back to Ham. So that's evolutionary racism that we also have to talk about, especially if we're going to talk about this kind of relationship with religion and science. And so I believe the way science can do that is through education. And I'm not saying a history of science course, because history of science, but if there are places, because we have all kinds of people on the line, but if you're an educator, if there's places where you can talk about and introduce a history of science and introduce these concepts, and even in the congregational setting, be able to talk about the way in which religion colludes with science to create such an atmosphere. I believe it starts with education.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I hear you saying that we both need to recognize the ways science can be a tool for justice and equality, but
Absolutely.
To do that, we also have to wrestle with the history of science and religion as they've played a role in systemic
Absolutely.
racism and the perpetuation of racist ideas. Reverend Clemons, Maybe you can just share with us as well about how you see science as a tool that can contribute to human flourishing or bring justice or equality in the areas that you're passionate about.
Well, I thought about this, and let's just take a journey back to the creation story in Genesis as it is laid out. It appears that if you believe in that story, is that God created everything in preparation for man to show up, and then He created man. And for a brief period, that was the shalom. There was this complete moment of shalom. And you have to think about how it came. It came with God turning chaos into order. And then man had the shalom, and then God gave him the authority to take care of it, to handle it, to deal with it. And of course, in the Christian faith tradition, sin entered in and chaos came in. And then ever since, man has been living in this kind of chaotic kind of thing as a result of sin. But then if you speak toward the eschaton, then there is another image of shalom, heaven. And so we live between two eternities, eternity past and eternity future. So when you live in the in between, you live between two peace lost in the peace promise. But the interesting thing is that when God created man and gave him the authority, He also gave him a responsibility and the intellectual capacity. He paraded all of the animals before man and told him to name them. And we're still trying to figure out some of the species and animals. But he paraded them, which meant that man has the intellectual capacity to be able to handle the responsibility that has been given.
Wow, yeah.
It's tainted by the intoxication of sin. And so I believe where science and religion intersect is that we have this responsibility to be curious, and we have this hole that is within us to try to create what we have lost. The goal, end of whatever particular discipline of science or whatever particular faith tradition that you come from, the end story of that is that of painting the image of peace, the betterment of mankind, the good of mankind. And so our struggle then in this in between is all of us are like, if you forgive me for being so blunt, we're like crackheads.
Yeah.
We've had this experience of shalom. They said the people who are substance have this one high that's so utopia that they spend all of the rest of their time trying to get it again. And so we are spending our time and energy. And so we need our scientists to read. You will remember at our last BioLogos conference, we worked from the theme that God has given us two books, the book of scripture and the book of nature. And so
yes.
all truth leads to God. And so we study and we are curious to find those truths, because if we can duplicate that order that He changed chaos from, is shalom.
Yeah, those are some really profound reflections on shalom. and the way that we both can struggle and strive for it and also live in the tensions of the not yet.
Yeah.
And so I'm just curious, we have some questions coming through. If you have questions that you would like to pose to Dr. Phillips or Reverend Clemons, please do so. But I want to ask you, especially in this moment, about shalom. How do you see the virtue of shalom connecting with, these real life and death issues right now that we're wrestling with as a society, and particularly communities of color are feeling the impact of, whether it's COVID-19 or someone earlier in the question feed asked about the death of George Floyd, and some of the really profound questions of bodies and inequality that we're facing as a society. So how do you see the virtue of shalom speaking to this moment as it relates to the science and faith conversation?
I think it's important to see this latest tragedy that is perpetrated on live TV, as important as it is. But quite frankly, it's just a tipping point. The frustration of the individuals that you see on the street, whether Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, whether American, whether French, or whether Europe, the frustration is no one seeming to care about our pain, and those who are in power seem not to care. And so the argument and the struggle has to be not the struggle of Black against white, one race against another. The struggle really is about right and wrong, light and darkness, truth and myth.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question? The question has to do with shalom and Black bodies in general. Okay. I thought it was
how you see it interfacing with science and faith.
Let me answer it from the perspective, because shalom is understood and as repair, Takam Ulam, world repair. I'm looking at shalom with respect to the death of George Floyd, as well as before that even happened, the fact that COVID-19 definitely in the US revealed the grave inequities that exist in Black and brown communities. And so Black bodies at the intersection of faith and science at this point seem to symbolize and represent the inequalities that that the democratic project is faced with. And the question is, in addition to protesting, how do you address that? One of my critiques at the beginning of the COVID-19 had to do with, and was tied to a fiction, which was that many Black Americans, African Americans were wondering if the disease impacted us as a race. And on social media, I would say it is a virus. Of course it impacts us. we are not immune from it. But my problem is that globally, because it started overseas, we weren't seeing ourselves represented. So I think in the move towards repair, shalom, and thinking about faith and science, and Black bodies, and rectifying or beginning to rectify these issues around Black bodies, representation is important.
Yeah.
So cultural representation, I think there wouldn't have been as many questions if we had gotten information from overseas, what was happening, that Black bodies were being, but we were, it was not on anyone's agenda.
Yes, that makes so much sense.
You know,
So
I'm sorry.
so for me, let's start with representation.
Yes,
You know,
critical.
I would add to that, excellent point. But I would add to that is nothing will really change unless we begin to see ourselves as one. And I heard someone say the other day that there are not many races, there's just one race, the human race. And until we can come to the realization that I will never be what I am meant to be as long as you are not what you meant to be. You know, I mean, I don't care how prosperous I become, I don't care how popular I am, if my brother or my sister is less than what they were meant to be, I am never what I was meant to be. And until we can drive that reality home, it's all the way through the text, it's all the way through scripture. I don't care how you read it. It's leading to that particular point. And that to me is shalom. Shalom is when you're the best that you can be and I am the best that I can be. We are the best that we can be. That's shalom. There
Yes.
is, that is that moment. And just a punctuation for that, when you talk about how does science and religion work, I think what we have been doing since 9:30 this morning is a demonstration of what science and religion, how they intersect. I looked at the participation, and there are 217 people who right now, and that number has fluctuated from 250 to 240 all morning. And some of the best minds, present company excluded, have been sharing wonderful principles about deep thinking in religious texts and theological texts, as well as the scientific world.
Yeah, and it's beautiful. It's been incredible to watch, and absolutely, profound. And you bring up such an important point, which is shalom. I'm reminded of the kind of South African concept of Ubuntu, I am because we are, and how we are all interconnected. And so there is a way in which the flourishing of one is the flourishing of all. And so we have to pay attention to how to advance flourishing in communities that are facing real threats. So I wanted to turn now to some questions, because we've been getting questions in our Q&A to ask you. And also wanted to just highlight, to go back to the highlight a point that you made, Dr. Phillips, which is representation. How critical representation, seeing people who look like you, hearing from people who understand your community, who understand your culture, is so important, and who understand your faith expression. We have many different traditions, the Black church tradition in particular, that we need to acknowledge that people speak out of where they're rooted, and they need to hear from people who are rooted in the same soil as they are. So I thank you for that point. And I want to ask now a question to Dr. Phillips. This is this person writes, are there resources available for congregational study about the intersections of the destructive theology of white supremacy and scientific study? For example, how did Christian thought about the devaluing of some human life contribute to a scientific culture that allowed for studies such as the Tuskegee syphilis program? And this is from Reverend Dr. Ruth Shaver.
Are there congregational resources? I don't think they're congregational resources. I think that there is a lot of scholarship, though, out there that address exactly what you said, the Tuskegee experiment in public health, in sociology, in anthropology. I mean, you can easily, in some respects, just put in, if you're doing a web, put in books on the Tuskegee experiment, and a plethora of books will come up. And I mean, when I say a history of science, meaning that the subjects that I touched on, which were also touched on earlier by speakers as I was listening, there's a lot of scholarship. Even if there are no actual congregational studies, you can get the scholarship and do a Bible study on or do a Sunday school class on this.
Yes. Yes. And I'm sure that we could, there's so many resources out there, and many people have been doing the hard work of really thinking and wrestling with these questions. So it's, just Google
Right.
is your friend, and also our libraries are your friends. So one of the final questions that I had just posed to Reverend Clemons, but both of you can really weigh in, is why should Christians care about racial disparities and inequities in STEM fields? Why should it be a matter of faith conviction to care about racial disparities in STEM fields? So Reverend Clemons, do you want to share some of your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I think when you started thinking about, let's go back to the Tuskegee. I asked one of my parishioners to give me some thoughts about this and the whole presentation. And one of the things that she pointed out is that African Americans have been the research as opposed to researcher. We've been the victim, the casualties of it, and then and once you've been the victim and the casualty, and then you turn around and you come back and you ask us to trust your judgment. That's a bitter pill to swallow. And so, as science is outrunning our laws, as science is going beyond what we are prepared ethically to legislate, to handle. And if you're a community that is not informed in the first place because of institutionalized racism, the knowledge is shut off from you. You don't purely understand the research. And then when it rolls out before you, then you're asked to trust it. And that's a quantum leap for a lot of individuals, particularly when you look at what Elaine's numbers suggest is less than 1%. We're underrepresented in the scientific community. So then if we can't get it from people of color and who we are likely to trust, and all of the information is coming from institutions that we are suspect of, then we choose to do some other options.
Yeah.
That does not necessarily mean that's in our best interest, but there are other options.
And so I'll dovetail on what Reverend Clemons said, because I wholeheartedly agree with what he's saying with respect to this notion of shalom. As pointed out in Elaine's text, wholeness includes diversity. It includes diverse voices.
Yes.
And so that's one of the reasons why the church community should be open to and willing to pursue this subject, because we need diverse voices. And so I go back to the question that the questioner asked, as well as this kind of representation. Because when I was thinking about it, and actually as I was reading Elaine's text, what struck me is the way in which Black Christian communities do the interface of religion and science is very different than the way in which white communities do it. Because I was like, oh, people really do Bible studies on climate change. People really do Bible studies on stem cell research. And so for me, it struck me as very theoretical. Versus when I think about Black Christian communities, and maybe possibly other communities of color, the way we interface faith and science often centers around healthcare ministries. And for less resource churches, they may not have the people in the pews, the members in the pews who can offer education around healthcare. But for more research churches, there's a draw across socioeconomic status. And so we can use those people to represent us in the scientific realm, as well as they become the representatives for young people who might have an interest in the sciences. So I remember growing up, I was never deterred from the sciences, because my parents had friends and saw people in the scientific arena.
Yeah.
So it's necessary. It's necessary for Christians to embrace this, because wholeness is about diversity, and diversity requires representation and educating those of us who are 1% to go into the sciences and speak from our particular context.
Yeah.
Dr. Snyder, can I just put a punctuation on what Nichole?
Yes, a quick punctuation, because we're at time, unfortunately, for the session.
Education is, it is key. It is key. We invited Deborah Harshmeyer with BioLogos to come to Pleasant Hill and give a presentation on the universe. That was like 3 or 4 years ago. Our congregation is still talking about the wonder and the glory and the majesty of black holes and solar systems, and how it relates to our faith, and how huge and how big our God is. So I think we must use science to really magnify the wonder and the glory and the majesty of our God, not just in the greatness of the universe, but in the smallness of a beetle.
Yeah, that is such a powerful word. Thank you both. I wish we could have this conversation for another hour. It's needed, it's necessary. More conversations like this need to be happening, but I'm so grateful for both of you, your insights, your expertise, your time, and also for Elaine and her work, and in recognizing the significance of this conversation in particular. So yes. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for your engagement. And we will see you for our next session. Go well.